Crucifixus Etiam. Manue Nanti joined the project to make some dough. $5 an hour was good pay, even in 2134 AD, and there was no way to spend it while on the job. Everything would be furnished: housing, chow, clothing, toiletries, medicine, cigarettes, even a daily ration of 180-proof beverage alcohol, locally distilled from fermented Martian mosses as fuel for the project's vehicles. He figured that if he avoided crap games, he could finish his 5-year contract with $50,000 in the bank, return to Earth, and retire at the age of 24. Manue wanted to travel, to see the far corners of the world, the strange cultures, the simple people, the small towns, deserts, mountains, jungles. For until he came to Mars, he had never been farther than 100 miles from Cerro de Pasco, his birthplace in Peru. A great wistfulness came over him in the cold Martian night when the frost haze broke, revealing the black, gleam-stung sky and the blue-green earth star of his birth. El mundo de mi carne, de mi alma, he thought. Yet he had seen so little of it that many of its places would be more alien to him than the homogeneously ugly vistas of Mars. These he longed to see: the volcanoes of the South Pacific, the monstrous mountains of Tibet, the concrete cyclops of New York, the radioactive craters of Russia, the artificial islands in the China Sea, the Black Forest, the Ganges, the Grand Canyon, but most of all, the works of human art. The pyramids, the Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame de Chartres, St. Peter's, the tile-work wonders of Anacapri. But the dream was still a long labor from realization. Manue was a big youth, heavy-boned and built for labor, clever in a simple mechanical way, and with a wistful good humor that helped him take a lot of guff from whiskey-breathed foremen and sharp-eyed engineers who made $10 an hour and figured ways for making more, legitimately or otherwise. He had been on Mars only a month, and it hurt. Each time he swung the heavy pick into the red-brown sod, his face winced with pain. The plastic aerator valves, surgically stitched into his chest, pulled and twisted and seemed to tear with each lurch of his body. The mechanical oxygenator served as a lung, sucking blood through an artificially grafted network of veins and plastic tubing, frothing it with air from a chemical generator and returning it to his circulatory system. Breathing was unnecessary except to provide wind for talking. But Manue breathed in desperate gulps of the 4.0 psi Martian air, for he had seen the wasted, atrophied chests of the men who had served 4 or 5 years, and he knew that when they returned to Earth, if ever, they would still need the auxiliary oxygenator equipment. "If you don't stop breathing," the surgeon told him, "you'll be all right. When you go to bed at night, turn the oxy down low, so low you feel like panting. There's a critical point that's just right for sleeping. If you get it too low, you'll wake up screaming and you'll get claustrophobia. If you get it too high, your reflex mechanisms will go to pot and you won't breathe. Your lungs will dry up after a time. Watch it." Manue watched it carefully, although the oldsters laughed at him in their dry, wheezing chuckles. Some of them could scarcely speak more than 2 or 3 words at a shallow breath. "Breathe deep, boy," they told him. "Enjoy it while you can. You'll forget how pretty soon, unless you're an engineer." The engineers had it soft, he learned. They slept in a pressurized barrack where the air was 10 psi and 25% oxygen, where they turned their oxys off and slept in peace. Even their oxys were self-regulating, controlling the output according to the carbon dioxide content of the input blood. But the Commission could afford no such luxuries for the labor gangs. The payload of a cargo rocket from Earth was only about 2% of the ship's total mass, and nothing superfluous could be carried. The ships brought the bare essentials: basic industrial equipment, big reactors, generators, engines, heavy tools. Small tools, building materials, foods, non-nuclear fuels, these things had to be made on Mars. There was an open pit mine in the belly of the Syrtis Major where a lake of nearly pure iron rust was scooped into a smelter and processed into various grades of steel for building purposes, tools, and machinery. A quarry in the Flathead Mountains dug up large quantities of cement rock, burned it, and crushed it to make concrete. It was rumored that Mars was even preparing to grow her own labor force. An old-timer told him that the Commission had brought 500 married couples to a new underground city in the Mare Erythraeum, supposedly as personnel for a local Commission headquarters, but, according to the old-timer, they were to be paid a bonus of $3,000 for every child born on the Red Planet. But Manue knew that the old trophies had a way of inventing such stories, and he reserved a certain amount of skepticism. As for his own share in the project, he knew, and needed to know, very little. The encampment was at the north end of the Mare Cimmerium, surrounded by the bleak brown and greened landscape of rock and giant lichens stretching toward sharply defined horizons except for one mountain range in the distance, and hung over by a blue sky so dark that the Earth star occasionally became dimly visible during the dim daytime. The encampment consisted of a dozen double-walled stone huts, windowless and roofed with flat slabs of rock covered over by a tarry resin boiled out of the cactus-like spine plants. The camp was ugly, lonely, and dominated by the gaunt skeleton of a drill rig set up in its midst. Manue joined the excavating crew in the job of digging a yard-wide, 6-feet-deep foundation trench in a 100-yard square around the drill rig, which day and night was biting deeper through the crust of Mars in a dry cut that necessitated frequent stoppages for changing rotary bits. He learned that the geologists had predicted a subterranean pocket of tritium oxide ice at 16,000 feet, and that it was for this that they were drilling. The foundation he was helping to dig would be for a control station of some sort. He worked too hard to be very curious. Mars was a nightmare, a grim, womanless, frigid, disinterestedly evil world. His digging partner was a slow-eyed Tibetan nicknamed Guy, who spoke the omnilingua clumsily at best. He followed 2 paces behind Manue with a shovel, scooping up the broken ground and humming a monotonous chant in his own tongue. Manue seldom heard his own language and missed it. One of the engineers, a haughty Chilean, spoke the modern Spanish, but not to such as Manue Nanti. Most of the other laborers used either basic English or the omnilingua. He spoke both, but longed to hear the tongue of his people. Even when he tried to talk to Guy, the cultural gulf was so wide that satisfying communication was nearly impossible. Peruvian jokes were unfunny to Tibetan ears, although Guy bent double with gales of laughter when Manue nearly crushed his own foot with a clumsy stroke of the pick. He found no close companions. His foreman was a narrow-eyed, orange-browed Low German named Vegeli, usually half-drunk and intent upon keeping his lung power by bellowing at his crew. A meaty, florid man, he stalked slowly along the lip of the excavation, pausing to stare coldly down at each pair of laborers who, if they dared to look up, caught a guttural tongue-lashing for the moment's pause. When he had words for a digger, he called a halt by kicking a small avalanche of dirt back into the trench about the man's feet. Manue learned about Vegeli's disposition before the end of his first month. The aerator tubes had become nearly unbearable. The skin, in trying to grow fast to the plastic, was beginning to form a tight little neck where the tubes entered his flesh, and the skin stretched and burned and stung with each movement of his trunk. Suddenly, he felt sick. He staggered dizzily against the side of the trench, dropped the pick and swayed heavily, bracing himself against collapse. Shock and nausea rocked him, while Guy stared at him and giggled foolishly. "Hoi!" Vegeli bellowed from across the pit. "Get back on that pick! Hoi, there! Get with it!" Manue moved dizzily to recover the tool, saw patches of black swimming before him, sank weakly back to pant in shallow gasps. The nagging sting of the valves was a portable hell that he carried with him always. He fought an impulse to jerk them out of his flesh. If a valve came loose, he would bleed to death in a few minutes. Vegeli came stamping along the heap of fresh earth and lumbered up to stand over the sagging Manue in the trench. He glared down at him for a moment, then nudged the back of his neck with a heavy boot. "Get to work!" Manue looked up and moved his lips silently. His forehead glinted with moisture in the faint sun, although the temperature was far below freezing. "Grab that pick and get started!" "Can't," Manue gasped. "Hoses hurt." Vegeli grumbled a curse and vaulted down into the trench beside him. "Unzip that jacket," he ordered. Weakly, Manue fumbled to obey, but the foreman knocked his hand aside and jerked the zipper down. Roughly, he unbuttoned the Peruvian's shirt, laying open the bare brown chest to the icy cold. "No, not the hoses, please." Vegeli took one of the thin tubes in his blunt fingers and leaned close to peer at the puffy, calloused nodule of irritated skin that formed around it where it entered the flesh. He touched the nodule lightly, causing the digger to whimper. "No, please." "Stop sniveling!" Vegeli laid his thumbs against the nodule and exerted a sudden pressure. There was a slight popping sound as the skin slid back a fraction of an inch along the tube. Manue yelped and closed his eyes. "Shut up! I know what I'm doing!" He repeated the process with the other tube. Then he seized both tubes in his hands and wiggled them slightly in and out as if to ensure proper resetting of the skin. The digger cried weakly and slumped in a dead faint. When he awoke, he was in bed in the barracks, and a medic was painting the sore spots with a bright yellow solution that chilled his skin. "Woke up, huh?" The medic grunted cheerfully. "How you feel?" "Malo," he hissed. "Stay in bed for the day, son. Keep your oxy up high. Make you feel better." The medic went away, but Vegeli lingered, smiling at him grimly from the doorway. "Don't try goofing off tomorrow, too." Manue hated the closed door with silent eyes and listened intently until Vigeli's footsteps left the building. Then, following the medic's instructions, he turned his oxy to maximum, even though the faster flow of blood made his chest valves ache. The sickness fled, to be replaced with a weary afterglow. Drowsiness came over him, and he slept. Sleep was a dread, black-robed phantom on Mars. Mars pressed the same incubus upon all newcomers to her soil, a nightmare of falling into bottomless space. It was the faint gravity, they said, that caused it. The body felt buoyed up, and the subconscious mind recalled going down elevators and diving airplanes and a fall from a high cliff. It suggested these things in dreams, or if the dreamer's oxy were set too low, it conjured up a nightmare of sinking slowly deeper and deeper in cold black water that filled the victim's throat. Newcomers were segregated in a separate barracks so that their nightly screams would not disturb the old-timers who had finally adjusted to Martian conditions. But now, for the first time since his arrival, Manue slept soundly, airily, and felt borne up by beams of bright light. When he awoke again, he lay clammy in the horrifying knowledge that he had not been breathing. It was so comfortable not to breathe. His chest stopped hurting because of the stillness of his rib cage. He felt refreshed and alive. Peaceful sleep. Suddenly, he was breathing again in harsh gasps and cursing himself for the lapse, and praying amid quiet tears as he visualized the wasted chest of a trophy. Wheezed an oldster who had come in to readjust the furnace in the rookie barracks.
"You'll get to be a Martian pretty soon, boy. I've been here 7 years. Look at me."
Manue heard the gasping voice and shuddered. There was no need to look.
"You just as well not fight it. It'll get you. Give in. Make it easy on yourself. Go crazy if you don't."
"Stop it. Let me alone."
"Sure. Just one thing. You want to go home, you think? I went home. Came back. You will too. They all do. Except engineers. Know why?"
"Shut up." Manue pulled himself erect on the cot and hissed anger at the old-timer, who was neither old nor young, but only withered by Mars. His head suggested that he might be around 35, but his body was weak and old. The veteran grinned.
"Sorry,"
he wheezed.
"I'll keep my mouth shut."
He hesitated, then extended his hand.
"I'm Sam Donnell, Mech Repairs."
Manue still glowered at him. Donnell shrugged and dropped his hand.
"Just trying to be friends,"
he muttered and walked away. The digger started to call after him, but only closed his mouth again tightly. Friends? He needed friends, but not a trophy. He couldn't even bear to look at them, for fear he might be looking into the mirror of his own future. Manue climbed out of his bunk and donned his fleece skins. Night had fallen, and the temperature was already 20 below. A soft sift of ice dust obscured the stars. He stared about in the darkness. The mess hall was closed, but a light burned in the canteen and another in the foreman's club where the men were playing cards and drinking. He went to get his alcohol ration, gulped it mixed with a little water, and trudged back to the barracks alone. The Tibetan was in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Manue sat down and gazed at his flat, empty face. "Why did you come here, Guy?" "Come where?" to Mars. Guy grinned, revealing large, black-streaked teeth. Make money. Good money on Mars. Everybody make money, huh? Sure. Where's the money come from? Guy rolled his face toward the Peruvian and frowned. You crazy? Money come from Earth, where all money comes from. And what does Earth get back from Mars? Guy looked puzzled for a moment, then gathered anger because he found no answer. He grunted a monosyllable in his native tongue, then rolled over and went to sleep. Manue was not normally given to worrying about such things, but now he found himself asking, what am I doing here? And then, what is anybody doing here? The Mars Project had started 80 or 90 years ago, and its end goal was to make Mars habitable for colonists without Earth support, without oxys and insulated suits and the various gadgets a man now had to use to keep himself alive on the fourth planet. But thus far, Earth had planted without reaping. The sky was a bottomless well into which Earth poured her tools, dollars, manpower, and engineering skill, and there appeared to be no hope for the near future. Manue felt suddenly trapped. He could not return to Earth before the end of his contract. He was trading 5 years of virtual enslavement for a sum of money which would buy a limited amount of freedom. But what if he lost his lungs, became a servant of the small aerator for the rest of his days? Worst of all, whose ends was he serving? The contractors were getting rich on government contracts. Some of the engineers and foremen were getting rich by various forms of embezzlement of government funds. But what were the people back on Earth getting for their money? Nothing. He lay awake for a long time thinking about it. Then he resolved to ask someone tomorrow, someone smarter than himself. But he found the question brushed aside. He summoned enough nerve to ask Vageli, but the foreman told him harshly to keep working and quit wondering. He asked the structural engineer who supervised the building, but the man only laughed and said, "What do you care? You're making good money." They were running concrete now, laying long strips of Martian steel in the bottom of the trench and dumping in great slobbering wheelbarrows full of gray-green mix. The drillers were continuing their tedious dry cut deep into the red world's crust. Twice a day they brought up a yard-long cylindrical sample of the rock and gave it to a geologist who weighed it, roasted it, weighed it again, and tested a sample of the condensed steam, if any, for tritium content. Daily he chalked up the results on a blackboard in front of the engineering hut, and the technical staff crowded around for a look. Manue always glanced at the figures, but failed to understand. Life became an endless routine of pain, fear, hard work, anger. There were few diversions. Sometimes a crew of entertainers came out from the Mare Erythraeum, but the labor gang could not all crowd in the pressurized staff barracks where the shows were presented, and when Manue managed to catch a glimpse of one of these girls walking across the clearing, she was bundled in fleece skins and hooded by a parka. Itinerant rabbis, clergymen, and priests of the world's major faiths came occasionally to the camp, Buddhist, Muslim, and the Christian sects. Padre Antonio Selny made monthly visits to hear confessions and offer Mass. Most of the gang attended all services as a diversion from routine, as an escape from nostalgia. Somehow it gave Manue a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach to see the sacrifice of the Mass, 2,000 years old, being offered in the same ritual under the strange dark sky of Mars, with a section of the new foundation serving as an altar upon which the priest set crucifix, candles, relic stone, missal, chalice, paten, ciborium, cruets, etc. In filling the wine cruet before the service, Manue saw him spill a little of the red clear fluid upon the brown soil. Wine, earth wine from sunny Sicilian vineyards, trampled from the grapes by the bare stamping feet of children. Wine, the rich red blood of earth, soaking slowly into the crust of another planet. Bowing low at the consecration, the unhappy Peruvian thought of the prayer a rabbi had sung the week before. Blessed be the Lord our God, King of the universe, who makest bread to spring forth out of the earth. Earth chalice, earth blood, earth god, earth worshippers, with plastic tubes in their chests and a great sickness in their hearts. He went away saddened. There was no faith here. Faith needed familiar surroundings, the props of culture. Here there were only swinging picks and rumbling machinery and sloshing concrete and the clatter of tools and the wheezing of trophies. Why? For $5 an hour and keep? Manue, raised in a backcountry society that was almost a folk culture, felt deep thirst for a goal. His father had been a stonemason, and he had labored lovingly to help build the new cathedral, to build houses and mansions and commercial buildings, and his blood was mingled in their mortar. He had built for the love of his community and the love of the people and their customs and their gods. He knew his own ends and the ends of those around him. But what sense was there in this endless scratching at the face of Mars? Did they think they could make it into a second Earth with pine forests and lakes and snow-capped mountains and small country villages? Man was not that strong. No, if he were laboring for any cause at all, it was to build a world so unearth-like that he could not love it. The foundation was finished. There was very little more to be done until the drillers struck pay. Manue sat around the camp and worked at breathing. It was becoming a conscious effort now, and if he stopped thinking about it for a few minutes, he found himself inspiring shallow, meaningless little sips of air that scarcely moved his diaphragm. He kept the aerator as low as possible to make himself breathe great gasps that hurt his chest, but it made him dizzy, and he had to increase the oxygenation lest he faint. Sam Donnell, the trophy mech repairman, caught him about to slump dizzily from his perch atop a heap of rocks, pushed him erect, and turned his oxy back to normal. It was late afternoon, and the drillers were about to change shifts. Manue sat shaking his head for a moment, then gazed at Donnell gratefully.
"That's dangerous, kid,"
the trophy wheezed.
"Guys can go psycho doing that. Which you rather have, sick lungs or sick mind?"
"Neither."
"I know, but
"I don't want to talk about it." Donnell stared at him with a faint smile. Then he shrugged and sat down on the rock heap to watch the drilling.
"Ought to be hitting tritium ice in a couple of days," he said pleasantly. "Then we'll see a big blow."
Manue moistened his lips nervously. The trophies always made him feel uneasy. He stared aside. Big blow.
"Lot of pressure down there, they say. Something about the way Mars got formed. Dust cloud hypothesis."
Manue shook his head. I don't understand.
I don't either, but I've heard them talk. Couple of billion years ago, Mars was supposed to be a moon of Jupiter. Picked up a lot of ice crystals over a rocky core. Then it broke loose and picked up a rocky crust from another belt of the dust cloud. The pockets of tritium ice catch a few neutrons from uranium ore down under. Some of the tritium goes into helium, frees oxygen. Gases form pressure. Big blow.
What are they going to do with the ice? The trophy shrugged.
The engineers might know.
Manue snorted and spat. They know how to make money.
Sure, everybody's getting rich.
The Peruvian stared at him speculatively for a moment. Senor Donald,
Sam'll do.
I wonder if anybody knows why we're really here. Donald glanced up to grin, then waggled his head. He felt thoughtful for a moment and leaned forward to write in the earth. When he finished, he read it aloud.
A plow plus a horse plus land equals the necessities of life.
He glanced up at Manue.
1500 A.D.
The Peruvian frowned his bewilderment. Donald rubbed out what he had written and wrote again.
A factory plus steam turbines plus raw materials equals necessities plus luxuries. 1900 A.D.
He rubbed it out and repeated the scribbling.
All those things plus nuclear power and computer controls equal the surplus of everything. 2100 A.D.
So
it's either cut production or find an outlet. Mars is an outlet for surplus energies, manpower, money. Mars Project keeps money turning over, keeps everything turning over. Economist told me that. Said if the project folded, surplus would pile up. Big depression on Earth.
The Peruvian shook his head and sighed. It didn't sound right somehow. It sounded like an explanation somebody figured out after the whole thing started. It wasn't the kind of goal he wanted. 2 days later, the drill hit ice, and the big blow was only a fizzle. There was talk around the camp that the whole operation had been a waste of time. The hole spewed a frosty breath for several hours, and the drill crews crowded around to stick their faces in it and breathe great gulps of the helium-oxygen mixture. But then the blow subsided, and the hole leaked only a wisp of steam. Technicians came and lowered sonar cameras down to the ice. They spent a week taking internal soundings and plotting the extent of the ice dome on their charts. They brought up samples of ice and tested them. The engineers worked late into the Martian nights. Then it was finished. The engineers came out of their huddles and called to the foremen of the labor gangs. They led the foremen around the site, pointing here, pointing there, sketching with chalk on the foundation, explaining in solemn voices. Soon the foremen were bellowing at their crews. "Let's get the derrick down. Start that mixer going. Get that steel over here. Unroll that dip wire. Get a move on. Shovel that fill." Muscles tightened and strained. Machinery clamored and rang. Voices grumbled and shouted. The operation was starting again. Without knowing why, Manue shoveled fill and stretched dip wire and poured concrete for a big floor slab to be run across the entire 100-yard square, broken only by the big pipe casing that stuck up out of the ground in the center and leaked a thin trail of steam. The drill crew moved their rig half a mile across the plain to a point specified by the geologists and began sinking another hole. A groan went up from structural boys. "Not another one of these things!" But the supervisory staff said, "No, don't worry about it." There was much speculation about the purpose of the whole operation, and the men resented the quiet secrecy connected with the project. There could be no excuse for secrecy, they felt, in time of peace. There was a certain arbitrariness to it, a hint that the commission thought of its employees as children or enemies or servants. But the supervisory staff shrugged off all questions with, "You know there's tritium ice down there. You know it's what we've been looking for. Why? Well, what's the difference? There are lots of uses for it. Maybe we'll use it for one thing, maybe for something else, who knows?" Such a reply might have been satisfactory for an iron mine or an oil well or a stone quarry, but tritium suggested hydrogen fusion, and no transportation facilities were being installed to haul the stuff away, no pipelines, nor railroad tracks, nor glider ports. Manue quit thinking about it. Slowly, he came to adopt a grim cynicism toward the tediousness, the back-breaking labor of his daily work. He lived from day to day like an animal, dreaming only of a return to Earth when his contract was up. But the dream was painful because it was distant, as contrasted with the immediacies of Mars. The threat of atrophy, coupled with the discomforts of continued breathing, the nightmares, the barrenness of the landscape, the intense cold, the harshness of men's tempers, the hardship of labor, and the lack of a cause. A warm, sunny Earth was still over 4 years distant, and tomorrow would be another back-breaking, throat-parching, heart-tormenting, chest-hurting day. Where was there even a little pleasure in it? It was so easy, at least, to leave the oxy turned up at night and get a pleasant, restful sleep. Sleep was the only recourse from harshness, and fear robbed sleep of its quiet sensuality, unless a man just surrendered and quit worrying about his lungs. Manue decided that it would be safe to give himself 2 completely restful nights a week. Concrete was run over the great square and troweled to a rough finish. A glider train from the Mare Erythraeum brought in several huge crates of machinery, cut stone masonry for building a wall, a ship full of new personnel, and a real rarity: lumber, cut from the first Earth trees to be grown on Mars. A building began going up with the concrete square for foundation and floor. Structures could be flimsier on Mars. Because of the light gravity, compression stresses were smaller. Hence, the work progressed rapidly, and as the flat-roofed structure was completed, the technicians began uncrating new machinery and moving it into the building. Manue noticed that several of the units were computers. There was also a small steam turbine generator driven by an atomic-fired boiler. Months passed. The building grew into an integrated mass of power and control systems. Instead of using the well for pumping, the technicians were apparently going to lower something into it. A bomb-shaped cylinder was slung vertically over the hole. The men guided it into the mouth of the pipe casing, then let it down slowly from a massive cable. The cylinder's butt was a multi-contact socket like the female receptacle for a 100-pin electron tube. Hours passed while the cylinder slipped slowly down beneath the height of Mars. When it was done, the men hauled out the cable and began lowering stiff sections of pre-wired conduit fitted with a receptacle at one end and a male plug at the other, so that as the sections fell into place, a continuous bundle of control cables was built up from bomb to surface. Several weeks were spent in connecting circuits, setting up the computers, and making careful tests. The drillers had finished the second well hole, half a mile from the first, and Manue noticed that while the testing was going on, the engineers sometimes stood atop the building and stared anxiously toward the steel skeleton in the distance. Once, while the tests were being conducted, the second hole began squirting a jet of steam high into the thin air, and a frantic voice bellowed from the rooftop, "Cut it! Shut it off! Sound the danger whistle!" The jet of steam began to shriek a low-pitched whine across the Martian desert. It blended with the rising and falling ooh-ah of the danger siren, but gradually it subsided as the men in the control station shut down the machinery. All hands came up cursing from their hiding places, and the engineers stalked out to the new hole carrying Geiger counters. They came back wearing pleased grins. The work was nearly finished. The men began crating up the excavating machinery and the drill rig and the tools. The control building devices were entirely automatic, and the camp would be deserted when the station began operation. The men were disgruntled. They had spent a year of hard labor on what they had thought to be a tritium well, but now that it was done, there were no facilities for pumping the stuff or hauling it away. In fact, they had pumped various solutions into the ground through the second hole, and the control station shaft was fitted with pipes that led from lead-lined tanks down into the earth. Manue had stopped trying to keep his oxy properly adjusted at night. Turned up to a comfortable level, it was like a drug, ensuring comfortable sleep, and, like addict or alcoholic, he could no longer endure living without it. Sleep was too precious, his only comfort. Every morning he awoke with a still, motionless chest, felt frightening remorse, sat up gasping, choking, sucking at the thin air with whining, rattling lungs that had been idle too long. Sometimes he coughed violently and bled a little. And then for a night or two he would correctly adjust the oxy only to wake up screaming and suffocating. He felt hope sliding grimly away. He sought out Sam Donnell, explained the situation, and begged the trophy for helpful advice. But the mech repairman neither helped nor consoled nor joked about it. He only bit his lip, muttered something non-committal, and found an excuse to hurry away. It was then that Manue knew his hope was gone. Tissue was withering, tubercules forming, tubes growing closed. He knelt abjectly beside his cot, hung his face in his hands, and cursed softly, for there was no other way to pray an unanswerable prayer. A glider train came in from the north to haul away the disassembled tools. The men lounged around the barracks or wandered across the Martian desert, gathering strange bits of rock and fossils, searching idly for a glint of metal or crystal in the wan sunshine of early fall. The lichens were growing brown and yellow, and the landscape took on the hues of Earth's autumn, if not the forms. There was a sense of expectancy around the camp. It could be felt in the nervous laughter and the easy voices, talking suddenly of Earth and old friends and the smell of food in a farm kitchen, and old half-forgotten tastes for which men hungered, ham searing in the skillet, a cup of frothing cider from a fermenting crock, iced melon with honey and a bit of lemon, onion gravy on homemade bread. But someone always remarked, "What's the matter with you guys? We ain't going home, not by a long shot. We're going to another place just like this." And the group would break up and wander away, eyes tired, eyes haunting with nostalgia. "What are we waiting for?" men shouted at the supervisory staff. "Get some transportation in here. Let's get rolling." Men watched the skies for glider trains or jet transports, but the skies remained empty and the staff remained close-mouthed. Then a dust column appeared on the horizon to the north, and a day later a convoy of tractor trucks pulled into camp. "Start loading aboard, men," was the crisp command. Surly voices. "You mean we don't go by air? We gotta ride those kidney bouncers? It'll take a week to get to Mare Erie. Our contract says, load aboard. We're not going to Mare Erie yet." Grumbling, they loaded their baggage and their weary bodies into the trucks, and the trucks thundered and clattered across the desert, rolling toward the mountains. The convoy rolled for 3 days toward the mountains, stopping at night to make camp and driving on at sunrise. When they reached the first slopes of the foothills, the convoy stopped again. The deserted encampment lay 150 miles behind. The going had been slow over the roadless desert. "Everybody out," barked the messenger from the lead truck. "Bail out. Assemble at the foot of the hill." Voices were growling among themselves as the men moved in small groups from the trucks and collected in a milling tide in a shallow basin overlooked by a low cliff and a hill. Manue saw the staff climb out of a cab and slowly work their way up the cliff. They carried a portable public address system. "Gonna get a preaching," somebody snarled.
"Sit down, please," barked the loudspeaker. "You men sit down there. Quiet, quiet, please."
The gathering fell into a sulky silence. Will Kinley stood looking out over them, his eyes nervous, his hand holding the mic close to his mouth so that they could hear his weak, trophy voice.
"If you men have questions," he said, "I'll answer them now. Do you want to know what you've been doing during the past year?"
An affirmative rumble arose from the group.
"You've been helping to give Mars a breathable atmosphere."
He glanced briefly at his watch, then looked back at his audience.
"In 50 minutes, a controlled chain reaction will start in the tritium ice. The computers will time it and try to control it. Helium and oxygen will come blasting up out of the second hole."
A rumble of disbelief arose from his audience. Someone shouted, "How can you get air to blanket a planet from one hole?"
"You can't,"
Kinley replied crisply.
"A dozen others are going in just like that one. We planned 300, and we've already located the ice pockets. 300 wells, working for 8 centuries, can get the job done."
8 centuries? What good?
"Wait,"
Kinley barked.
"In the meantime, we'll build pressurized cities close to the wells. If everything pans out, we'll get a lot of colonists here and gradually condition them to live in a 7 or 8 psi atmosphere, which is about the best we can hope to get. Colonists from the Andes and the Himalayas, they wouldn't need much conditioning."
"What about us?" There was a long, plaintive silence. Kinley's eyes scanned the group sadly and wandered toward the Martian horizon, gold and brown in the late afternoon.
"Nothing about us,"
he muttered quietly. "Why did we come out here?"
"Because there's danger of the reaction getting out of hand. We can't tell anyone about it, or we'd start a panic.
He looked at the group sadly.
I'm telling you now, because there's nothing you could do. In 30 minutes.
There were angry murmurs in the crowd. You mean there may be an explosion?
There will be a limited explosion, and there's very little danger of anything more. The worst danger is in having ugly rumors start in the cities. Some fool with a slipstick could hear about it and calculate what would happen to Mars if 5 cubic miles of tritium ice detonated in one split second. It would probably start a riot. That's why we've kept it a secret.
The buzz of voices was like a disturbed beehive. Manue Nanti sat in the midst of it, saying nothing, wearing a dazed and weary face, thoughts jumbled, soul drained of feeling. Why should men lose their lungs that after 8 centuries of tomorrow, other men might breathe the air of Mars as the air of Earth? Other men around him echoed his thoughts in jealous mutterings. They had been helping to make a world in which they would never live. An enraged scream arose near where Manue sat. They're going to blow us up! They're going to blow up Mars!
Don't be a fool,
Kinley snapped. Fools, they call us. We are fools. Forever coming here. We got sucked in. Look at me. A pale, dark-haired man came wildly to his feet and tapped his chest. Look, I'm losing my lungs. We're all losing our lungs. Now they take a chance on killing everybody.
Including ourselves,
Kinley called coldly. We ought to take him apart. We ought to kill everyone who knew about it, and Kinley's a good place to start. The rumble of voices rose higher, calling both agreement and dissent. Some of Kinley's staff were looking nervously toward the trucks. They were unarmed.
You men, sit down,
Kinley barked. Rebellious eyes glared at the supervisor. Several men who had come to their feet dropped to their hunches again. Kinley glowered at the pale upriser who called for his scalp.
Sit down, Handel.
Handel turned his back on the supervisor and called out to the others. Don't be a bunch of cowards. Don't let him bully you.
You men sitting around Handel, pull him down.
There was no response. The men, including Manue, stared up at the wild-eyed Handel gloomily, but made no move to quiet him. A pair of burly foremen started through the gathering from its outskirts.
Stop,
Kinley ordered.
Turpin, Schultz, get back. Let the men handle this themselves.
Half a dozen others had joined the rebellious Handel. They were speaking in low, tense tones among themselves.
For the last time, men, sit down.
The group turned and started grimly toward the cliff. Without reasoning why, Manue slid to his feet quietly as Handel came near him.
Come on, fellow, let's get him,
the leader muttered. The Peruvian's fist chopped a short stroke to Handel's jaw, and the dull thunk echoed across the clearing. The man crumpled, and Manue crouched over him like a hissing panther. Get back, he snapped at the others, or I'll jerk his hoses out. One of the others cursed him.
Want to fight, fellow?
The Peruvian wheezed.
I can jerk several hoses out before you drop me.
They shuffled nervously for a moment. The guy's crazy, one complained in a high voice. Get back or he'll kill Handel. They sidled away, moved aimlessly in the crowd, then sat down to escape attention. Manue sat beside the fallen man and gazed at the thinly smiling Kinley.
Thank you, son. There's a fool in every crowd.
He looked at his watch again.
Just a few minutes, men. Then you'll feel the earth tremor and the explosion and the wind. You can be proud of that wind, men. It's new air for Mars, and you made it. But we can't breathe it, hissed a trophy.
Kinley was silent for a long time, as if listening to the distance.
What man ever made his own salvation?
He murmured. They packed up the public address amplifier and came down the hill to sit in the cab of a truck, waiting. It came as an orange glow in the south, and the glow was quickly shrouded by an expanding white cloud. Then, minutes later, the ground pulsed beneath them, quivered and shook. The quake subsided, but remained as a hint of vibration. Then, after a long time, they heard the dull-throated roar thundering across the Martian desert. The roar continued steadily, grumbling and growling as it would do for several 100 years. There was only a hushed murmur of awed voices from the crowd. When the wind came, some of them stood up and moved quietly back to the trucks, for now they could go back to a city for reassignment. There were other tasks to accomplish before their contracts were done. But Manue Nanti still sat on the ground, his head sunk low, desperately trying to gasp a little of the wind he had made, the wind out of the ground, the wind of the future. But lungs were clogged, and he could not drink of the racing wind. His big, calloused hand clutched slowly at the ground, and he choked a brief sound like a sob. A shadow fell over him. It was Kinley, come to offer his thanks for the quelling of Handel. But he said nothing for a moment as he watched Manu's desperate Gethsemane.
Some sow, others reap, he said.
Why? The Peruvian choked. The supervisor shrugged.
What's the difference? But if you can't be both, which would you rather be?
Nanti looked up into the wind. He imagined a city to the south, a city built on tear-soaked ground, filled with people who had no ends beyond their culture, no goal but within their own society. It was a good, sensible question. Which would he rather be, sower or reaper? Pride brought him slowly to his feet, and he eyed Kinley questioningly. The supervisor touched his shoulder.
Go on to the trucks.
Nanti nodded and shuffled away. He had wanted something to work for, hadn't he? Something more than the reasons Donald had given him. Well, he could smell a reason, even if he couldn't breathe it. 800 years was a long time, but then, long time, big reason. The air smelled good, even with its clouds of boiling dust. He knew now what Mars was, not a 10,000-a-year job, not a garbage can for surplus production, but an 8th-century passion of human faith in the destiny of the race of man. He paused short of the truck. He had wanted to travel, to see the sights of Earth, the handiwork of nature and of history, the glorious places of his planet. He stooped and scooped up a handful of the red-brown soil, letting it sift slowly between his fingers. Here was Mars, his planet now. No more of Earth, not for Manue Nanti. He adjusted his aerator more comfortably and climbed into the waiting truck.